So I just started recording just to let you know.
Okay, thank you. So welcome to this training about metadata. Today, well, we have a quite short training session, so it's approximately 1 hour. So, and we have a large subject. Metadata is a quite wide concept, so we can actually only scratch the surface of this subject today. But I hope that after this presentation, you will get the clear picture what is the importance of the metadata in what comes to research data management. So the agenda today will be that we first go through some basic concepts about metadata and documentation in general, and then some tools and methods for documentation. But the main focus will be on metadata for publishing. So we'll have some sample repository records. We'll go through and you can see what kind of metadata might be provided when you are publishing your data set. So first, let's get clear with some concepts. So what is metadata? Metadata is something actually which some people think it's a quite abstract thing, but actually you are encountering metadata not almost every day, but very often in your everyday life. For example, when you think about a library catalog and you are trying to find a book, and then you find an interesting book and you try to find more information about the book. So all that more information is actually metadata. So it's giving the information like what is the authors of the book, what is the publisher, what is the ISBN number, and all that sort of thing. So that is metadata. So you can say that metadata is data about the data or description about the data. These are quite common definitions. So if you are thinking about metadata in this kind of way, it is actually already giving some requirements, what kind of information you have to provide about the data. So the data must be informative enough and accurate enough so that it will fulfill these requirements. When we are thinking about metadata in the research, it is basically all the data documentation about the data. So it should be answer questions like who created the data, what kind of data it is. So name like descriptions, disciplines, maybe the format, when the data was created, the timeline, when it was published, if it's published in a data repositories or repository, how the data was created, for example, the methods, equipment, software which we are included, and how it was processed, or all these editing procedures, and where the data is located. For example, if it's been published in a repository, there should be information about the persistent identifier and how the data can be reused. For example, if there is licenses, that information should be also included in the metadata. So basically you can say that metadata in the research data, it should be provide all the information which is needed to understand, interpret, and utilize research data correctly. And why the metadata is important? Well, I actually did provide already in the previous slide the reason. So it's the most important thing, it is that it is making research data understandable, but it is also making things more easier to find, and it will make research data searchable. For example, when we are thinking about this library catalog, it is based on all these metadata records in there, and it's providing lots of metadata. So if you know the title of the book, you can find, because of all this rich metadata, these library catalogs are providing, you are finding the book that you are looking for. And then metadata is also making things more reusable, for example, by licensing and providing enough documentation to make the dataset more understandable. And it is making data also citable. For example, persistent identifiers are one of the main things which are needed to make data citable. So if the data can be always located, it doesn't matter whether it's removed somewhere, but if it has persistent identifier, you can always locate the data and always cite the data. And if the data is citable, it's also making clear who actually created the work. So you will get the credit for your work if you, for example, will publish your data in a data repository. And it is easier with the metadata, it's also easier to share and open your data. And people can judge whether your research results are accurate, and they can replicate your data if there is enough information provided form as a data documentation. So actually metadata is a quite a crucial thing when you talk about reproducibility of the data. And good metadata record will actually help people to evaluate whether they can use your data. So they don't need to access the data set itself. So if there's a metadata record, they can simply just browse that through and read, for example, the description, and then decide whether they will actually want to download the data set itself. And all these things which I've been listing in here, they are actually part of these FAIR data principles, and these principles are sort of aiming to make FAIR data more findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable, both by humans, but FAIR data concepts are actually especially targeted to machines, so that machines would find data more easier. So by these terms, for example, by findable, FAIR data principles is stating that dataset should be provided by persistent identifier, and accessible means that it should be, for example, be able to search via internet. And interoperable means that the data should be offered in such a format that people can actually access the dataset. For example, it should be able to open the dataset without any special software. And reusable means that, for example, license is provided for possible reuses, so they can understand how they can reuse the data in what terms. And in FAIR data principles, the metadata is actually more important than data. And you can say that metadata and data, they need each other, because data without accurate data documentation is actually quite meaningless. It doesn't really tell anyone to anything. And same applies to metadata, because metadata itself, it doesn't really have much value as it is. The only value it is getting is because it's giving this information about the data. I've been dividing metadata to 3 different types. Sometimes you can see even broader, that it is divided to 6 different types, but I think that this is quite common way of dividing them to 3 different types of metadata. So first there is this descriptive metadata, and that is all about to discover and identify datasets. So this metadata is telling things like who are the authors, title, abstract, keywords, persistent identifier, basically this basic information about the dataset. Then there is a structural metadata, and that is for navigating purposes. So this metadata is explaining how the dataset is, for example, organized internally, about the file and directory structure, and how the dataset is relating to other datasets, for example, version to other versions of the dataset. And then there is administrative metadata, which is for managing purposes. And this kind of metadata is giving information like who can access the data and the licenses and so forth. Then about data documentation and metadata. About documentation and metadata concepts in general, they are sort of concepts which are used interchangeably. And so when people are talking about metadata, they are actually meaning documentation and so forth. But some people are actually saying that documentation is a larger concept and the metadata is a part of documentation. But I've been interpreting this in such a way that data documentation and metadata is sort of the same thing. They are, both are trying to tell the story about the data so that the data would be understandable enough. But there is a distinction that very often metadata is sort of interpreted that it is more structured way to describe data, and data documentation is meant more to be read by humans. So it is there's a slight difference maybe in this this kind of documentation, what they are. And I've been dividing this data documentation in two parts. So there is a documentation during the research project, and then there is the documentation when you are publishing the datasets. So this is called discovery metadata. And today we are concentrating on this discovery metadata. And in there you need a slightly different things what you need in this documentation during the research project. So you need, when you are publishing your datasets, you need information like the content description, this basic information like the title and creator. Then you need the usage rights, for example, the license information. You need the information about identifiers, for example, DOIs, which are provided by the data repositories usually. And then there's this number 4, which is supportive documentation, which is basically all the documentation which is needed to make the dataset or data understandable. And there is no strict line between these two stages of the documentation, because basically, for example, in this part 4, this supportive documentation part in this publishing datasets, it is heavily relying on all the information which are already gathered in this stage 1 documentation during the research. And there is not really a single correct way for documentation. So all the methods and tools you will need in your documentation depends solely on your research project. So basically, the level of the documentation which you are providing must be decided in each research project individually. So there is, you can't really apply the same kind of documentation to different projects. And one of the recommendations is that you should use the tools and methods which will make your data understandable, and not just for other users, but for you also and your colleagues. So a good question to ask when you start to do the documentation is that if someone who is unfamiliar with your research wants to find, evaluate, understand or reuse your data, what information they would need. And the documentation during the research, that should be started in the very beginning of the project. And one of the easiest way to start this is creating a so-called data management plan, which is sort of a very short document telling how we are going to treat your data during the research project and what will happen to your data after the research project has finished. And the one recommendation is also that you should use a coherent structure in the documentation. So you should use metadata standards and vocabularies if they are suited for research data and there is something like that to use. And you don't need to usually create them from scratch, because there is lots of like this tools available, different data management software you can use. And the last recommendation is that this data documentation should be, for example, methods should be kept in a separate subfolder along with your data. So it is always there available for anyone who might need to understand your data. And here is the list of methods and elements and tools of data documentation. And this is not a list which you should actually follow consistently. This is just basically different kind of options which you might have when you are doing the data documentation. So first there is this kind of a household organizing sort of tips and tools and the processes you should apply, which basically most people, when they are processing research data and collecting research data, they're actually doing. So these household duties or organizing methods are naming the files consistently and using a consistent, clear folder structure, for example, hierarchical one, and maybe tag and give keywords to files so that you can find them afterwards. And then there's, of course, version control, which you can use automatic tools for creating those. Then there is tools which are more like making these research data more understandable, and so these kind of data dictionaries and code books and README files and laboratory notebooks and metadata standards. And for example, these data dictionaries, they are sort of providing information what each elements are actually meaning in your data. And README files are sort of very simple text documents which are providing information about data files. And metadata standards and vocabularies, they are basically this kind of controlled way describing your data. And this discovery metadata and research records are more related to when you are publishing your dataset. Then you need them. So research records, for example, are sort of background documents about the data. For example, it might have things like publications related to the data. Maybe there is a data management plan as a supplementary document, or even a project plan and a research plan in there included. A little bit more about these metadata standards or schemas and vocabularies. Very often we might have, it's not always clear what you mean for different elements when you are describing your data. For example, you have a word author. So sometimes for other people, it's not always clear what you mean by author. What comes to dataset, do you mean the creator of the dataset, or do you mean, for example, maybe the author of the publication which is related to this dataset? And metadata standards are actually something which gives easy solution for this kind of a problem, because they are actually giving the controlled way to provide what each elements mean. So if you, for example, use this author in a certain, like a Dublin Core, which is one metadata standard in that context, so everybody will understand that, okay, it's a Dublin Core metadata standard, and it means it has element author. That means that it means the author of the dataset, not the author of the publication. So that's basically the idea of using these standards or schemas and vocabulary. So they give sort of consensus, so the other researchers will understand what you are meaning when you are describing different elements. And also it's more easier to compare different data sets to each others when they are being structured in the same way. So for example, schemas are, they are these specific structures. And the schema will list what information you will need to include about your data and how that information should be structured. And then sometimes when these schemas are used continuously, or even they might be even accepted like officially, then they become standards. So metadata standards are always schemas which are very well documented. And these standards and schemas should be used in data documentation if there are such things available. So that means that they are especially beneficial if you are handling large quantities of data, or you think that your data would be most likely to be reused. Then these kind of tools would be really beneficial. And there are many types of metadata standards and schemas. Some are just general, and some are more discipline-based. And I've provided here this link to this British Digital Curation webpage, where is quite a good list of different metadata standards from different disciplines. And if you would like to find out whether your discipline are providing a specific metadata standard. And there's also lots of tools for creating this metadata. So you don't need to really do that from scratch. So I've provided also a list for the tools here, and it's the same British Digital Curation Center, which is providing the tools. When we are talking about depositing data to a data repository, they are behind them there is usually a certain kind of metadata standard, but the interfaces, what they are using, so you don't really need to have a deep knowledge about the metadata standard when you are uploading data sets to a data repository, because the interfaces are easy to use, so you just provide your own individual information to these fields and the metadata is created. It's working in the background. And some examples about metadata standards, there is these general standards, and the purpose of these metadata standards they are a little bit different depending are they general standards or whether they are these discipline-specific metadata standards. So these general standards are usually more for data citation and discovery purposes. And there's two examples. There's this DataCite metadata schema, which is used, for example, this kind of general repository, data repository called Zenodo. And it's a good standard because it's suitable for any type of data set. And the same applies to this another one, which is called Dublin Core, which is really old standard. It was actually first used in the libraries. And it is also suitable for any type of data sets. And it's good because it's very interoperable with other standards because you can map different elements easily with this standard. And these general standards are quite good, but they are lacking sometimes. They are too generic, let's put it this way. So that's why there is a lot of these discipline-based specific metadata, because these metadata standards, they are meant really for understanding data sets and for reuse the data set. So the elements must be slightly different in these standards. And there is one example of this DDI, which is Data Documentation Initiative Metadata Standard. And this standard is especially for survey or observational data for social sciences. And we actually have the example of this, one of these data repositories, which is using this metadata standard. Metadata for publishing. When you are preparing your dataset for publishing, you have to decide what kind of metadata you are providing. And it depends really on two things. Firstly, on the data repository. So you should need to find out what metadata is required, especially if you want to, you are meaning your data for long-term preservation, not just uploading your data but it's meant for long-term preservation. You think it has some long-term preservation value, then usually it's quite important to know exactly what kind of metadata is required by that particular repository which you are thinking to uploading your metadata. And the second thing is, of course, the purpose of opening or archiving a data set. So if you like just your data set for discovery, then you don't need much metadata at all. Basically, just title and the creators is enough, and maybe the persistent identifier. But if you want your data set to be for example, replicate your study, then you start to need much more metadata in there included, much more data documentation. So you need to have, for example, this what kind of software you've been using, about the code things, anything which might make your data so that other people are able to reproduce the results. And for reuse, you actually need an extensive amount of metadata, because then you don't have a clear picture what would be the reason people would like to reuse your material. So you need basically to guess what they need. So the metadata you must provide quite a lot of metadata for that. And as I said earlier, the discovery metadata is especially for this, if the data set is meant for reuse or for replication purposes, then the documentation is relying heavily on the documentation which is already created during the research. So there must be some kind of a really extensive metadata included. And generally, you should think this data set metadata record in there in the data repository like a standalone document. So it should be independent research output. For example, it shouldn't be something which is one has to go to if there is an article related, to have to actually read the article to be able to understand the data set. So that's not the purpose at all. Let's go to these examples. So first there is example of a Finnish social science data archive. And this archive is suitable for survey and interview data, and especially for long-term preservation. And the discipline is social sciences, and sometimes they, under certain circumstances, they also accept data from other relevant fields, such as arts and humanities. And the metadata standard is this DDI, Data Documentation Initiative, and all these datasets are stored in XML format, which is suited for long-term preservation. So this is the example, and it is interview data and is qualitative research. And let's now have a look how it's the actual record. So you can see just from one glance that this metadata record is actually providing quite a lot of information. So there's lots of different metadata fields provided in here. Let's first look at the title of the dataset. So title is sort of a calling or card or business card of your dataset. So that should be quite short but very informative, so that it should actually include at least the topic of the dataset and geographic location if that's necessary, and also the time frame of the dataset. Here there is the time frame, there is the year provided, and there is the topic, but it also could be that there could be that it is from Finland, this dataset. It's about Finnish interviewees, but this information is actually provided other metadata fields. And the title should also be descriptive, but you shouldn't use, for example, things which are sort of obscure. So you should be quite like a precise. So don't say current. So use 2021, or then you shouldn't use abbreviations which are not maybe understandable for other users. So for example, saying IoT, that might be okay, and most likely it is, but then using DDI in a title there is a lot of meanings for DDI. So that wouldn't be maybe advisable to use. And also one recommendation is that you very often see that the title is identical to if there is a article related to the dataset. So this article title and the dataset title are very often identical. So that's not maybe a good solution to do. So the title of the dataset should be sort of individual, if that's possible to do that. Then we can see that there is a persistent identifier provided by the data repository in here, and that is something when you are deciding where to publish your dataset, you should find out that they do provide this persistent identifier for citations reasons, because without that your data isn't really fully citable. Then they are providing author information and the affiliations of the dataset, and if it's possible to have the ORCID, this data repository doesn't provide such information, not of my knowledge at least. But if that is provided, for example, Zenodo is giving that option, that would be something which is good to use always ORCID, because that is also a unique identifier which is distinguishing these authors together. So it's you are getting the credit to the right persons. And about the abstract this is something which is the same with any research article. So this is actually defining whether people will want to download your actual data set. And so this should provide all the information them to do that decision. So abstract should provide information like what the data is all about. So the information is provided here in the very first sentence. Then it should be giving information that why the data set was actually collected. And this kind of background information is actually, they are giving the information here in the first paragraph, that it is part of their research project. Then in the abstract should be also information that how, when, and by whom the data were collected, and then what method were used and how the data was processed. And this information is given in the second paragraph in here. And also, like, would be good to also provide information about geographical location and the temporal coverage of the data. They don't provide that information here, but that is, as I said, it is mentioned in another metadata field further on. But they are giving the background information about the interviews, how they were done, and also the information that this dataset is available only in Finnish, which is a good piece of information to have, because anyone who doesn't understand Finnish won't most likely download the dataset then. The keywords should be used, these kind of which are discipline-based, if that's possible to use. But these are also the ones which help people to actually find your dataset from this data repository. Another metadata fields which are sort of interesting is the access, this administrative metadata information. So you can see that this data is meant for reuse data, but you cannot, it's available for research, teaching, and study, which actually means that it is not freely downloadable in here. So you have to actually register to the data repository in order to download the dataset. And here is also this time frame information and collection dates and geographical coverage of the data. And another piece of interesting metadata information here is how this interview were done. The information is provided in here, and also how the data were processed. So there is the information, for example, that they've been anonymized, all this information. And if we go see what is actually to download these data files, and we actually see what's inside them, we can see that there is the actual data folder is in here, but then there's these README files, both in Finnish and English provided. And these README files are really good to always attach along with the data files, so that because they actually provide the information so that anyone who actually come across this data set, they can understand what this data is all about. So this is the README file of this data set or data files, and you can see it's basically providing the very same information what was there in this metadata record, but it is also giving information like how to open the zip files and so forth. And most likely it is providing information also about the data files themselves. And if we go further with this file structure, we can see that in the actual data folder, there is this another folder which contains the data, but then there is these supplementary files, which are actually the background information about how this data were collected. And the actual data files, there is also information in them. So this is all the interviews. They are, firstly, they are in text files, so they are really easy to open with any kind of software. But there, inside these data files, there is embedded information about the interview itself. So it is in Finnish, but there is the information about what was the time of the interview, what was the sex of the interviewee, education, organizational affiliation, how long this interview took place. Another example is totally different. So this data set and data record or metadata record is from Research Catalog. And this Research Catalog is an open access database, which in where you can archive artistic research, and it is also published artwork, and it also serves as a publishing platform for journals. And this is interesting database because it doesn't actually provide any persistent identifiers to these data sets as such, so only for these journal articles. And these data sets are called expositions, and they can be many types of media files, including like text, video, images, and so forth. And metadata fields are kept in minimum, so there is basically only 4 compulsory metadata fields provided by this. So it's a date, title, description, and copyright information. And this copyright information is really important because we are talking about artwork in here. So this is the first page of this one sample file or exposition. So I don't have an art background, so to me it was really difficult to understand this first page, how to navigate in here, and how I will find the information which is this metadata information. So there I can't see too much structure in here. But then when I go to to this metadata page, then it starts to look actually a little bit more familiar. So there is this, you can see there is this description provided. So it tells what this exposition is all about. And then there is a little bit more metadata provided. So there is things like type, keywords, date, last modified, and the copyright owner and the license of the data set. And this is, it's quite understandable actually that they don't provide any persistent identifiers, because you can modify these data sets in here. So, and in artwork is very difficult to actually define when it's finished. So it's a completely, we are talking about completely different kind of discipline in here. And I think it's a good example what kind of data repositories there is and what kind of metadata they are providing and requiring. Last example is about publishing data in a data journal, which is a really good way, especially if your research is all about creating data. This is a very good way of publishing this data and getting sort of a more wider audience for it. So these data journals are basically, they are peer-reviewed journals, but they are for data. So you can describe data in there. So it's not for analysis, analysis of the results or anything like that. And these articles in the data journal, they are basically full data documentation. So the structure is that they provide the, like in the same way, like in typical articles, they provide abstract, there's the introduction, data description, methods and materials, and so forth. But the data journals are really good in that way that others can cite your data properly. Your data is, this data article is getting this persistent identifier. These are peer reviewed, and they are having the impact factors just as or ordinary these academic journals. And it can make your data easier to find, for example, from data repository, because these data journals are usually indexed by these citation databases like Scopus or Web of Science. And here is the example of this kind of a data set which has been published in the data documentation has been published in the data journal. So the actual data itself, it's in this Mendeley data repository, and the data documentation has been published in a journal called Data in Brief. So this is the outline of the the article in the data journal, and you can see that the structure is identical to scientific articles. So there's abstract keywords and so forth. Then we have the abstract in the data journal, and then we have this description part in data repository. And this is they differ, which is a good thing, because as I said earlier, that very often you see that this, if you have an article and there is a related data set, then very often the description of the data repository it's being copy-pasted from this abstract from the journal article, which is not really a good thing at all, because it should be a standalone document, what is there in this data repository. And then if you look at more closely what's there, the information in the data journal, we can see that there is this specifications table in this particular journal, which is actually giving a lot of information about the data set. There is all kind of information about the description of the data collection, to the type of data, and how data were collected, and so forth. And also the abstract is giving description of the data, and the possible future reuses are also given examples how it could be reused, the data. And then when we look at the metadata in the data repository, we can see the title. Okay, that is identical now to the data journal, which is not a bad thing in this case, because the data journal is actually the data documentation. So they can be identical, but you can see that it is the dataset itself is also having this persistent identifier. So both the data documentation, which is published in the journal, that has the own individual persistent identifier, and also this dataset has its own. More metadata is here, so there is this information how you can cite the dataset, the institutions which is included in here, and then there is the license information. And the license is really important because it will actually define and other possible users that how they can actually use your data. And one of the common ways is to use this Creative Commons license, and this is this CC BY license is actually one of the widest. So there is no limit of the reuse of this dataset, except you need to just give the credit for the data creators. And then there is this description part, which is basically answering the questions which it should be answering. So it's answering the question like why the dataset were created, and so forth. And the last paragraph in the description is the actual description about the files, what they consist of. Okay, but these were the examples, and I will thank you at this point. And if there is any questions,